Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. Let's talk about a book, The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. If you have never read this book, well, I recommend you read it, especially if you are interested in fantasy, science fiction, or Dungeons and Dragons, or Final Fantasy. This is a tremendously influential book and series by Jack Vance that encompasses a lot of different little pieces of both the fantasy and science fiction genres as we would probably think of them today. Like a lot of books from, say, pre 1980, it's less a single novel. I'm thinking of like a lot of the Elric books and things like this. And it's really a collection of short stories. And so if you approach it as a collection of short stories, and the main character is the dying earth, it's the setting that exists that holds everything together, then it really is an interesting book to read. It won't ever bore you. You won't ever get bogged down in superfluous details or plot. Every time Vance shows you something about the world, it's going to be something new and interesting and even thought-provoking. Every story has its own conflict and its own resolution and its own revelation about the dying earth. It takes place maybe in like the super future. The earth is dying. There are alternate realms, right, that might be reminiscent of really old fantasy, like Lord Dunsany, right? The fairy realms and stuff. This is stuff that's in my books too. Alternate realms that are hidden from the earth. There is the presence of ancient technology that people have forgotten about, but yet nevertheless sticks around, even if those people don't remember how to use it. So if you've played most of the Final Fantasy games, the first Final Fantasy game has this in it. It has robots and technology from like a fallen, forgotten civilization. And it's present in the new Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy 16. A technologically advanced civilization that decayed and was replaced by something that's more medieval in its appearance and its attitudes. That's in The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. That's a big part of the setting that you get there. There's a story about two competing cultures that literally can't see each other while they live at the same city. There's a lot of speculative ideas. It's what I think makes science fiction from the olden days so interesting, is you start with an idea and then you just sort of carry it through the story and see where it goes. And it creates really interesting plots, really interesting conflicts that you can't get outside of a fantasy or science fiction genre, where you're not bound by the setting of our real world, but can instead remake the rules of how the world operates so that the plot can proceed in interesting and novel ways. So lots of that kind of stuff. There's a great use of irony in one of the later stories. I think it's the last story, where a guy's forced to judge who's the prettiest girl in the town. And why did they try to make them all look ugly? He picks the prettiest girl and everybody's disappointed because it turns out she's like a human sacrifice for this ghost. They encounter, of course, ancient technology that is mysterious and strange to them, yet holds lots of secrets for both the history of the earth as well as how they can solve the conflict of the story. Most of the stories proceed with that as like there's some sort of solution to it that is going to be either using magic or is going to be using technology. And sometimes you can't really predict which one they're going to use or even what the big difference is between them, because most of the magicians they can like memorize one spell per day because the ancients knew all of the magic. So they're really, again, are accessing a kind of ancient technology. It's just in the form of magic. And remember that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So if you're in the science fiction area, in a technical sense, science fiction is actually a subgenre of fantasy as far as how the stories work. People always get offended when you say that because they imagine that science fiction is somehow like smarter. But it's like, they have a warp engine. It's just magic hand waving when you get down to it. They use jargon to try to disguise the fact that it's magic. But you need that magic to facilitate new and interesting plots. Like Star Trek wouldn't be fun if they weren't able to travel to new planets every week and seek out new life and new civilizations where each thing presents a novel and interesting problem to solve, a new conflict each time. So in this book, we get a bunch of different little conflicts and a bunch of different little solutions, from wizards to women. There's a guy who's had his like face magically transformed. What's going to be the solution to that? So lots of interesting conflicts. So each story will keep you guessing as to how it's going to end up getting solved. And every character too, I think, has such a personality. Vance is really able to make them jump off the page and make you care about them and their outcomes really right away. There is an audiobook of this on Audible, and I've listened to it a little bit, and I think it's a pretty good version as well. So if you're looking for the audio version to listen to, I think that's a good way to access this classic book. Otherwise, you can buy it. And then, of course, it exists in several different anthologies and collections, depending on how you want to access it. And then there's a series that will continue that. Now, I mentioned that it's really influential on fantasy. If you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, the original versions of Dungeons and Dragons had a different feel from what developed. It developed into, say, from Dragonlance on, into something that it has its own weird medievalist fantasy identity. But earlier on, it was more, the setting and the rules were more influenced by things like Jack Vance. And the magic systems of, like, you can do this spell once a day. Like, the systems were very inspired by things like the Dying Earth. So you can gain a perspective on your tabletop playing by playing what inspired some of the thoughts that, like, Gary Gygax had when designing Dungeons and Dragons, and other game designers as the 80s would progress and this idea of tabletop RPGs would grow. It's something that I think I don't want to say the genre, like the genre can't forget things, but maybe the fandom. The fandom has forgotten a lot of stuff that existed before 1980, a lot of the classic fantasy that inspired the games which they like to play and the settings which they like to interact with, whether it's a game like D&D or it's a video game like Final Fantasy, which has all of these elements still in it. So whether it's one of those things, you have to look a little further back than Wheel of Time or a Brandon Sanderson novel to really know how the genre developed and what it was. Things became kind of mushed together, I think, after the 80s, and everyone ended up settling into a sort of pseudo-medievalist feeling for a lot of their fantasy. Not completely, right? Brandon Sanderson, I think, has a lot of sci-fi elements in his stuff, and I think he delivers on those pretty well. But he probably is pretty well read with older genre stuff, and that can help that. So it's a great idea if you're writing fantasy to broaden your horizons, look at older things, and Jack Vance is, I think, a really, really good one to dig into if you've never read it. And The Dying Earth, it's a great setting. It's a very inspiring setting. It'll keep you guessing, and it'll make you think about what you're doing as an artist as well. So leave me your thoughts down below if you've read Dying Earth and if you have some thoughts about it, or any other like classic science fiction and fantasy settings and books that you think people should read, like Black Company by Glenn Cook. There's so many ones that people don't even think about now when you're like, oh, do you read fantasy? And they're like, I like Game of Thrones and I read Name of the Wind, and I'm like, that makes me sad. It's like, you should be reading Poul Anderson and Michael Moorcock, and especially Robert E. Howard and Edgar Rice Burroughs, to go really far back to stuff like that. And you should be reading Jack Vance and Glenn Cook. These are the things that people need to ingest more of. And I'm telling you, like, once you go back to some of these kinds of stories, modern stuff is just going to feel so slow. Like, it takes so long to get the details out if you're reading something modern, like these big doorstops that, they have their fans, and that's fine if you're a fan of the doorstoppers, but please give the tighter, older style a chance as well. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below, and I'll talk to you all next time. Have a great, great day. Don't forget, you can join my Patreon. You get a free book every month. It rotates, or something with the Ko-Fi. It's over there. There it is. Same idea there. And you can listen to my No Talkie Talkie ambient music channel. That'll be linked down below in the description as well. Have a great one. And yeah, check out The Dying Earth by Jack Vance.